In the first election since the Voice referendum, there is concern from some First Nations communities that Indigenous affairs policy hasn't accounted for a substantive share of this election campaign. Labor has made announcements on jobs and economic empowerment for Indigenous Australians. The coalition says it's encouraging economic development and is promising audits of expenditure in Indigenous affairs. The major parties have both said more needs to be done to close the gap in outcomes between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Moving away from proposals such as treaty and truth-telling, Labor is now focusing on what it calls the Remote Jobs and Economic Development Program, which will create up to 3,000 jobs over 3 years and is the first stage of replacing the Community Development Program, or CDP. The government recently announced an $842 million investment for Indigenous people in the Northern Territory, with funding for employment opportunities, women's safety, children's health, education and alcohol harm reduction. Labor has also expanded the Indigenous procurement policy, which means it's boosted its target for a share of Commonwealth contracts going to Indigenous-owned businesses. Meanwhile, the coalition is promising a complete overhaul if it's elected. It wants an audit of all government programs and expenditure in Indigenous affairs and reprioritise unnecessary funding towards frontline solutions. The opposition has promised a royal commission into sexual abuse in Indigenous communities right away if it's elected. National Indigenous Correspondent Carly Williams joins me now in the studio to unpack these Indigenous policies on offer this election. Hi there, Carly. So talk us through the main pledges from both parties.
Well, since the failed Voice referendum in 2023, Labor has walked away from Uluru Statement reforms, that is, treaty and truth-telling. The Prime Minister has recently ruled out legislating a voice to Parliament as well. In February, he told ABC's Q&A program that the government is going in another direction, focusing on economic development and taking work for the dole and turning them into real jobs. That's what the Prime Minister said. This is a $707 million program to create about 3,000 new jobs, and that will replace the Community Development Program, the CDP. Labor's also extended TAFE in the Northern Territory. There's $165 million for rangers. And let's not forget policy for all, like health policy, that greatly benefits Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, like $25 scripts and more urgent healthcare clinics in places like Darwin. But let's think back to 2022, the election campaign. Labor had these big aspirational ideas. They wanted to take the country to a referendum on a voice. They wanted to abolish the cashless debit card and overhaul CDP. And this took up a lot of airtime. They were happy, loud and proud to talk about these policies. In this election campaign, the policies we're talking about today, it's not getting as much as of a run. And you can see that in the recent leaders' debate on ABC. David Spears asked several Indigenous affairs questions. The leaders took 1 or 2 minutes to answer them. This is in a debate that was more than an hour. Let's talk about the coalition's main talking points. It's audits, audits, audits. They want inquiries into land councils and to establish a royal commission into child sex abuse in Indigenous communities, not communities across Australia, just Indigenous communities. The coalition also has a focus on remote jobs and education. There's $100 million recently announced for boarding school infrastructure for remote Indigenous students.
So while there are a lot of similarities, there are some big differences. Can you explain what those are?
Labor is all about creating jobs. The coalition is all about cutting waste. But if I can use the domestic violence policies announced this week by both major parties, now these aren't specific Indigenous policies, but we do know that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and families and individuals are overwhelmingly affected by domestic violence. So Labor announced a range of measures to address financial abuse. The coalition says it'll build a domestic violence national register. Shadow Minister for the Prevention of Family Violence, Karen Little, says the coalition will increase the powers of the Domestic Violence Commissioner.
She will have audit responsibilities. There are billions of dollars that go into investment in reducing family violence, domestic violence and sexual violence. We want to make sure that she can look into where the programs that were going to be delivered are delivered as they intended.
So, Carly, how are First Nations voters reacting?
I feel like there's a bit of frustration in some communities about the timidity from the government to talk about big ticket items like truth and treaty. And many elders have told me they're still quite hurt about Peter Dutton's comments late last year about not wanting to stand in front of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags, acknowledging that he has not brought that up again in this campaign or this year. Minister Malarndirri McCarthy, she is out in remote communities at the moment. The Minister for Indigenous Australians is in talking about the Rangers programs. This is all over her TikTok, but people have said to me, well, we don't see that on the government's main platforms. Minjerribah Morgumpin Elders in Council is a grassroots organisation in southeast Queensland, which has a huge Aboriginal population. They've released a statement venting their frustrations about the lack of big ideas in this campaign. They're still reeling from the cancellation by the Queensland government of taking away that Queensland Truth and Healing Inquiry, and they wanted the federal government to step in more there, intervene and throw their support behind and bring that truth inquiry back to Queensland. So they're calling for a First Nations-led truth-telling commission. They want continued funding for justice reinvestment, and they want the major parties to outline clear and measurable Indigenous policy commitments during this campaign, even though we have a little more than a week left, a week and a bit.